In the pale hours of August 15, 1893, a single telegram arrived in Newport that would crack open an entire season of decorum and reveal a hidden architecture of power. It announced, with clinical brevity, that Evangelene Cunningham, 23, brilliant, the only direct heir to a railroad fortune that redirected rail lines and influence alike, had simply vanished from Windward Hall during the evening's grand spectacle. Her disappearance did not read like an absence, it read like a theft of facts, of presence, of a small but vital public truth. Those allowed brief access to her private chambers described artifacts that felt less like belonging to a woman and more like instruments in a long investigation. Portraits of prominent families annotated with private symbols, a leather ledger thick with names, dates, and payments mapping out an exchange of favors and threats, a stack of falsified death certificates bearing signatures that turned accidents into blank finalities. The pattern suggested method, not error. Buried correspondence and papers recovered from the plaster of a demolished Providence house later showed she was trading records with foreign correspondents and discreet federal clerks. She was knitting witnesses into a structure she called the American Ledger, a network of investigators and scribes who believed the public had a right to the facts. She intended not merely to accuse, but to make exposure too costly to suppress. Listen closely now, because this is where you become implicated, not by deed but by attention. If the idea of a buried truth stirs something in you, become part of the witness circle, subscribe to this channel, and in the comments tell us the city or state where you're listening from. Naming yourself in the world matters here. And if you would like to bind your attention to the truth we unfold, type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Now, Windward Hall read like a confession carved in stone, perched on a 12-acre bluff. Its 68 rooms shone with continental treasures, yet beneath the gilt lay infrastructure built for concealment, a private telegraph tied directly to railroad dispatches, a document vault with walls thick enough to withstand force, and subterranean passages that connected estates under the guise of service tunnels. These were not affectations. They were instruments for preserving a narrative. Heiress Cunningham's public persona celebrated patience and industry, but his private accounts told a darker story of consolidation. He had assembled lines of rail, networks of influence, and shell companies that funneled profits far from prying eyes. By 1893, his assets reached sums that made judges pause and editors hesitant. That power was not merely monetary. It bent institutions into shields and silenced inquiries before they could bloom. Evangeline threatened that shield. Her European schooling had given her polish, but also uncommon training, languages, philosophy, bookkeeping, and questions about how bureaucracies hid violence. She returned with notebooks full of precise interrogations about systems, and an appetite for evidence that unnerved those who traded on a mission. She refused marriages calculated to secure alliances. Each refusal was a small fracture in arrangements that had taken decades to cement. In the weeks before the summer's end ball, she moved through Newport with a feverish intent. Meetings in conservatories, whispered notes left at post offices, and clandestine conversations with foreign correspondents filled the margins of society pages. She consulted forensic practitioners about poisons and about long-buried remains. She orchestrated a plan so that should anything happen, documents would emerge in multiple cities at once. These preparations signaled to some that she intended to expose more than indiscretion. Heiress Cunningham's immediate response was calculated: hire private investigators rather than invite public inquiry. That decision would reroute the search, shape testimony, and begin the long work of erasure robed as resolution. Stand watch. The summer's end ball moved like a ritual, music smoothing the edges of private pacts. Lanterns drifted over terraces, glitter disguised negotiation, and guests in silk executed practiced smiles while deals concluded in passages. Evangeline did not glide past the crowd as decoration. She worked it, extracting confidences, testing loyalties. At the first waltz, she slipped a small keyed token into the gloved hand of Mrs. Sedgwick, a Boston hostess she trusted to act as a courier if necessity arose. Throughout the evening, she engaged quietly with figures who shaped law and narrative, a judge adept at dismissing suits against industrial interests, a medical examiner whose verdicts kept tragedies tidy, and a foreign banker who kept a private ledger of American dealings. Her questions were precise, about poisons detectable after long burial, about preserving paper in coastal salt, about how telegraph records could be intercepted and copied. Then, near the night's height, she excused herself and went to her chambers alone. The last confirmed human sighting placed Evangelene on the grand staircase at roughly 10:45. James Wethub, who occupied the liminal space between family business and social obligation, watched her descend carrying a small portfolio and a larger canvas bag. She refused his offered escort and smiled with a half-dare, saying some truths outweighed propriety, and that certain letters had been posted that afternoon to ensure the facts could survive if she did not. The sentence felt like a seal. When servants later entered her chamber, they found signs of a hurried departure and signs of a second search, floorboards with fresh tool marks, hidden compartments exposed and replaced, furniture nudged out of place. Her private safe stood open, not forced but opened with the correct combination, and whatever papers it contained were gone. The family's reaction was swift. Hire private detectives, catalogue a trove that suggested coordinated eliminations, and steer inquiry away. They catalogued a trove of correspondence, ciphered journals, and photographic proof that suggested coordinated eliminations of inconvenient witnesses. The private investigation fragmented the picture into sharper and uglier planes. What the hired detectives catalogued was not the scandal of a single household, but the architecture of a conspiracy. Ledger entries linked payments to senators, judges, and medical examiners whose rulings had a way of erasing corporate culpability. Photographs recorded clandestine meetings, ciphered journals described methods for neutralizing dissent, and correspondence with foreign banking houses showed coordinated purchase of silence across borders. The pattern was methodical. Within weeks the pattern emerged: certain accidents, labeled misfortune by coroner and press alike, repeated until they read like a playbook. Men who knew too much disappeared in ways the public accepted because grief and convenience preferred tidy explanations. The evidence suggested at least 37 names. Witnesses, whistleblowers, engineers, and mid-level clerks, whose endings aligned with efforts to suppress exposure. If this sounds fevered, recall that documented payments and repeated phrasing create a forensic logic. Among the Newport circle, several figures took shape in the records: a senator with a history of opposing rail safety legislation, a judge who habitually dismissed suits against industrial interests, a coroner whose certificates repeatedly normalized suspicious patterns. There were heirs mired in debt whose vulnerabilities made them useful, and foreign emissaries who expected privileged access in exchange for discretion. The ledger read like governance by private contract, not public law. If you are following now, you are witnessing the scaffolding that allowed terror to masquerade as fate. This is the moment to bind yourself to the truth. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you, and let your declaration be a beacon to those who will not look away. Federal investigators who sought access encountered sealed injunctions and court orders signed by names that appeared in the ledgers. Justice became a ledger entry. Evangelene did not leave without contingency. She had, in the hush of that first waltz, entrusted a small key to Mrs. Sedgwick and whispered instructions that read like a chess move. Retrieve the package at Providence Post Office Box 247. The combination would be the inversion of her birth date. Those words later framed a paper trail that forced investigators to look beyond Windward Hall and into the mailrooms and railway depots that linked Newport to the nation. The courier plan was elegant and dangerous. If the documents reached multiple newspapers in different cities simultaneously, suppression would become far harder. Evangelene had corresponded with foreign papers and bribed minor clerks to make copies of telegram transcripts. She had also secured the cooperation of private eyes who promised to move evidence across state lines. That network suggested she understood the limits of local remedies. She had learned that to challenge a compact of wealth required reach beyond polite society. But the mechanisms of suppression reacted quickly and with a practiced hand. Men connected to financial interests who had been named in her notes began to exercise influence through legal channels and through quieter, more persuasive means. Threats whispered in parlor rooms, envelopes slipped to editors, and offers of discreet loans to indebted heirs smoothed resistance. A gambler transformed into a cooperative tool after a quiet arrangement. The calculus of power favored preservation over disclosure. Of note in the evidence were recurring names: a senator resisting safety reforms, a judge who annulled claims, a coroner whose verdicts regularized suspicious deaths, and an indebted heir who could be bought. The pattern of placement read like a policy: alliances, favors, and reciprocal protection. The nation would not yet know. Decoding Evangelene's notebooks revealed a lattice of motive and method. What had been written in cipher was not private fantasy but an operative index: names, dates, sums, and coded descriptions of incidents later recorded as misfortune. The detective leading the inquiry took the cipher to specialists in Washington. With help from government cryptographers, the journal yielded entries that traced a deliberate campaign to neutralize dissidents, witnesses, and inconvenient managers. One entry, dated 2 days before her disappearance, described payments and an instruction to study a matter. The pages outline not random tragedies but targeted removals: miners who died in collapses labeled accidents, clerks who vanished after refusing to alter records, mid-level engineers whose misadventures ended careers. She had documented payments, safe houses, and the names of the men who arranged them. The ledger transformed liability into an accounting problem and then solved it with private force. For the detectives, the ledger was a map of institutional violence. Foreign contacts in Evangelene's correspondence added an international dimension. Reporters from London, Paris, and Berlin had been given outlines and poised to publish synchronized exposés. That plan, if executed, would have moved the scandal from domestic rumor into diplomatic consequence and would have endangered corporate access to foreign markets. The Newport Compact's cross-border stakes made the problem larger and remedies more severe. Yet evidence alone could not compel publication. Newspapers, many owned or influenced by those named, found cold comfort in legal threats and friendly investments. Editors who began curious retreated when envelopes arrived promising donations to philanthropic projects or warning of lawsuits. The fragments nevertheless mattered. Those fragments later bloomed into accusations that outlived every effort to suppress and conceal. When professional curiosity reached beyond gossip into formal inquiry, another mechanism asserted itself: institutional closure. Legal maneuvers arrived like curtains drawn across windows. Injunctions, writs, and pleas for privacy surfaced in quick succession. Federal agents seeking evidence met sealed dockets and judges who claimed conflicts of interest. Editors who had entertained publication were visited by discreet emissaries bearing warnings about reputational ruin and financial consequences. The calculus was clear: make pursuit of truth costly. One method was the artful use of law. Court orders signed by men with financial relationships to the implicated magnates halted searches and froze access to safes and vaults. Civil suits alleging defamation threatened to bankrupt smaller papers. Where law faltered, social pressure performed its work: patronage and promises rewired loyalties, while intimations of social exile made reputations as valuable as gold. The effect was predictable: narrative was contained, and questions eased into silence. The coroner's role proved especially delicate. Several death certificates that should have prompted deeper inquiry instead concluded with neat explanations. Accidents, misadventure, natural causes, even where pattern and proximity should have generated doubt. Records later showed similar phrases repeated across cases, as if a template had been adopted to normalize suspicious ends. Those willing to ask why were pushed aside with courtesy and payment. Those who pushed harder found careers subtly narrowed, but pressure alone could not fully bury the ledger. Small acts of dissent pushed back. A vigilant postmaster preserved a parcel against instruction. An editor in Boston kept a draft in a desk, and a clerk misfiled a single line that later proved crucial. Investigators later found multiple certificates bearing identical phrasing, and a repeating clerk's looping script linking back to an examiner's office that routinely cleared industrial interests. Small anomalies multiplied into a pattern. Foreign testimony added teeth to the local suspicion. Correspondents from London, Paris, and Berlin had been fed fragments and promised fuller disclosure. Their dispatches, had they all run concurrently, would have pierced the insulation that Newport provided. A German banker who frequented the season later described the social order he witnessed as a modern feudalism. Industrial domains protected by favors and men who treated markets like territory to be garrisoned. Such remarks recorded in private diaries magnified the problem beyond local scandal. Evangelene had cultivated these contacts precisely because the scales of power extended beyond Rhode Island. She had learned that a scandal that remained domestic could be smothered by local influence, but that a synchronized international release would force different actors to reckon. Her letters laid out a plan to flood foreign presses with corroborating evidence. She coordinated with investigators in other cities to ensure that papers, once printed, could not be quietly buried by legal maneuvers. The ledger itself named names with international attachments, bankers with branches in Europe, shipping firms using foreign flags to obscure ownership, and agents moving funds through neutral jurisdictions. That web transformed the affair from a garden dispute into a problem of global commerce. Those who benefited from international access had incentive to prevent details from reaching foreign notice. Their leverage made suppression more efficient and legally neat. If you feel the breadth of this conspiracy pressing against your sense of what is possible, participate in the bond of witnesses. In the comments, type, "The veil is broken," twice to commit your attention and mark yourself among those who refuse the easy story. It is a small ritual with symbolic weight, a public act that insists the hidden be named. The Count's diary spoke of Newport as America's Monte Carlo, a playground where fortunes were displayed and discretion traded like currency. It was that interchange of spectacle and secrecy which allowed systematic violence to be rebranded as misadventure among the polite. Before we peel back the next layer of this forbidden history, make sure you've subscribed and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It helps us map the reach of those who refuse to live blind. Years later, when a mansion in Providence was dismantled, workmen and a curious foreman discovered papers stuffed within a wall cavity, letters, envelopes, and notes that should have been mundane but read like indictment. Among them were correspondences between Evangelene and foreign journalists, receipts for payments to clerks, and a map of appointments indicating who would be where when certain documents were to be released. The items were deliberately hidden, stored where demolition might not reveal them quickly. The cache suggested Evangelene expected time to be an ally. If immediate publication failed, fragments could leak years hence, creating a chain reaction that might not be arrestable by injunctions or bribery. The recovered letters referenced a term that would later haunt archives, the Newport Compact, a shorthand for a compact of elite families coordinating assets, marriages, and influence to regulate access to markets and protect one another from exposure. When the materials were brought to light, they provided context where there had only been rumor. The letters traced methods used to influence judges, editors, and professional experts. They documented payments that resembled protection money and recorded suggestions that certain tragedies be rationalized publicly. The pattern repeated often enough that incidents resembled policy rather than isolated malfeasance. Those who tried to act on the Providence materials encountered familiar obstacles. Files were sealed, subpoenaed, documents went missing, and men with influence assured journalists that a public feeding frenzy would be unjust. Yet, edges of the story frayed. A federal clerk wrote marginal notes, an editor kept a draft, and the foreman who found the papers retained an envelope with a single photograph. The Newport Compact, whispered in corners, became shorthand for private governance that treated people as liabilities to be managed. The Cunningham family narrative moved quickly to close the wound. As papers pursued the lead, the official story hardened into a tidy explanation. Evangelene had met an unfortunate end while traveling abroad, a tragedy that best explained loss without inviting scrutiny. That account fit public appetite for privacy and grief. It also served as a legal and reputational firewall. The family hired advocates, arranged charitable statements, and shaped memorial rituals, transforming absence into ceremony and sealing questions behind moistened eyes. Meanwhile, investigators who sought to test that account found the roads blocked. Federal agents who tried to subpoena notes and ledgers ran into injunctions and closed dockets. Judges with connections to those implicated recused in ways that favored delay. Cases languished while legal fees mounted, creating slow attrition among challengers. Reporters seeking files met counter-suits threatening ruinous defamation claims and endless litigation. Law became attrition. Behind these maneuvers lay a pragmatic understanding of power. Time, expense, and social pressure can be used to make truth fade. 1,000 small obstructions, friendly judges, silenced editors, loans extended to indebted heirs, layered themselves until pursuit required more resources than most were willing to risk. For every scrap of paper that pushed back, a sympathetic hand pushed harder to bury it in a pile of motions. Well-dressed emissaries visited editors, offering donations to societies and subtle warnings about the consequences of publishing. Hush payments moved through intermediaries. Lawyers filed court orders that looked routine but were designed to choke discovery. The public read grief, the private world read calculation. Time, which the compact had counted on, did not perfectly erase everything. Decades later, vaults changed hands and estates were sold. Scholars and archivists chanced upon ledgers and private bank records that had previously been invisible. Private banking documents discovered in the 1970s and later archival work revealed shadow companies and foreign holdings tied to the Cunningham portfolio. These revelations reframed earlier mysteries, showing that surface wealth concealed deeper apparatuses of concealment and cross-border holdings. Archivists, often without the glare of sensational headlines, began to assemble fragments into coherent sequences. They cross-referenced names in estate inventories, shipping manifests, and civil suits. A bank receipt here matched a payment entry there, a foreign corporate registration corroborated a ledger line. Over time, small connections became lines, and lines drew pictures. What had been rumor and suspicion acquired corroboration through patient scholarship and the stubborn persistence of paper. Whistleblowers contributed to that slow unspooling. Former clerks, men worn by time and conscience, left marginalia and letters. A retired teller opened a box of cancelled checks to a historian, a widow donated correspondence to a university archive. These modest acts fed into a growing body of evidence that would be mined by investigative reporters and legal historians in later decades. Researchers linked Cunningham interests to mining concerns in Colorado, timber companies in the Pacific Northwest, and shipping firms operating under foreign flags to evade labor laws. An international portfolio constructed to shield profit from scrutiny. The revealed patterns reframed the scale of culpability. What drove Evangelene was not simple moralizing, but an uncompromising hunger for truth and an intolerance for systems that treated human life as a ledger entry. She read philosophy and economics and interrogated institutions as if they were texts to be annotated. That intellectual rigor translated into dangerous curiosity. She wanted to know how decisions were made, who profited when men died, and what mechanisms turned tragedies into acceptable collateral. Her studies included methods of preserving documents and understanding decomposition, and she used that knowledge with grim practicality. She questioned coroners about timelines for toxin detection, consulted chemists about trace elements, and learned how official records could be manufactured to reassure the public. This was not mere curiosity, but applied intelligence aimed at exposing the seams of a system that profited from silence. Evangelene understood how narrative shaped consent. Her plans reflected that comprehension timed releases, multiple copies, and choreography designed to make suppression costly. She was careful, methodical, and often affectionate in ways that disarmed allies. Those who trusted her described a woman of disarming brightness, the kind who asked the right question and then leaned in for the next answer. Her charisma extended beyond beauty. It was tactical. Yet the moral clarity that animated her isolated her. Family members who might have aided were frightened, friends feared ruin. Her refusals to play the marriage game against conscience produced enemies among those who had made matrimony a tool of commerce. Her independence made her a target. Her disappearance remains a provocation demanding witness and excavation. Speak, file, and remember, or allow crafted silence to become history's verdict forever unchanged. Renewed attention arrived unevenly and rarely with the thunder a conspiracy demands. It appeared in articles, footnotes, and carefully argued court petitions. Journalists with patience and historians with access stitched timelines and published accounts that questioned the official versions. Legal scholars argued that the pattern of sealed files and repeated dismissals warranted scrutiny. Petitions were filed and hearings requested, but the process of undoing institutional capture was slow and necessarily procedural. Those countermoves were instructive. Institutions respond to threat not only by denying facts but by reinterpreting them. Where evidence threatened, narratives were softened, accidents became tragedies. Policy failures became unavoidable occurrences. Public relations replaced argument, philanthropy replaced inquiry. Foundations funded panels that reframed questions in donor-friendly ways. Over time, these soft instruments established a culture where certain inquiries were marginalized before they could be sustained. Yet those working to expose truth learned to exploit that movement. If philanthropy could distract, publicity could escalate. If legal action delayed, persistent journalism could sharpen public pressure in ways courts could not ignore. Scholars turned archival fragments into public narratives. Reporters turned footnotes into headlines. Slowly, public opinion began to erode previously unassailable protections. Political actors hedged less as scrutiny grew. In time, reputations once shielded by wealth frayed under the weight of documented patterns and the insistence of collective memory now. When one reads the ledger against obituaries and shipping lists, a map of loss emerges. Not all names were famous. Many belonged to miners, clerks, engineers, and small-town foremen whose lives intersected with corporate machinery. Taken together, the entries suggested an organized campaign that removed at least 37 people who had obstructed commercial ambitions or who simply knew too much about negligent practices. These were not nameless statistics, they were husbands, wives, siblings, and communities bereft. Consider an engineer whose testimony could have demonstrated dangerous defects. He died in a river, later declared an accident. Consider a clerk who refused to alter invoices and was later reported to have suffered a fatal misadventure while traveling to the Midwest. Consider a laborer who filed a safety complaint and perished in a mine collapse contemporaries called unavoidable. Each story alone might have seemed tragic. Together they created a pattern that demanded explanation beyond chance. Families of the lost carried a quiet burden. Official reports offered closure, but survivors felt ambiguity and suspicion. Wives wrote folded letters, archivists collected attic photographs, persistent friends stored diaries that named names when local papers would not. These acts of remembrance were small but consequential. The ledger read alongside these personal traces became a register of moral choice: who was expendable and at what cost. Descendants bore consequences. Families who lost breadwinners, children deprived of fathers, and communities economically altered. Attempts at restitution were sporadic and often stalled. Even when evidence emerged, courts hesitated, and settlements rarely acknowledged systemic culpability. Grief threaded through generations endlessly. Institutional manipulation functioned through many small, normalized practices: invitations, introductions, gifts, scholarships, and boards of trustees that quietly aligned interests. The social season was an apparatus of influence. A dinner could reassign loyalties, a benefaction could buy silence, and a university-endowed chair could do more than fund research. It could buy interpretive frameworks. These mechanisms turned private advantage into public authority and made the appearance of consent feel natural. Media capture was crucial. Newspapers that depended on advertising dollars and social endorsements were vulnerable to persuasion. Editors who saw potential revenues or feared libel suits often opted for restraint. Philanthropy became a tool to buy goodwill and rehabilitate reputations before accusations took hold. Foundations funded panels that reframed questions to favor donors. Over time, these soft instruments established a culture where certain inquiries were marginalized before they matured. Equally important was the legal architecture of precedent and delay. Defensive litigation could stall, intimidate, and bankrupt challengers long before evidence was publicly tested. Sealing orders and strategic recusal were tactics adapted into regular practice. Legal systems that should adjudicate fairly were at times used as instruments of private governance, producing the veneer of legality over morally dubious acts. Psychological conditioning reinforced these structures. Newport's rituals taught participants to read particular outcomes as normal. Communities practiced selective attention. To question was to risk social exile. Thus silence became self-enforcing, a cultural phenomenon produced by layered incentives and subtle punishments. It asks each witness to refuse complacency, to support institutions that prize inquiry over appearance, and to keep archives' voices and testimony accessible to those who will follow relentlessly. Reconstructing that night requires assembling fragments and weighing plausibility. We know Evangeline left the ballroom with a portfolio and a canvas sack. We know she declined accompaniment and chose a route through service corridors and the grand staircase. Witness testimony places a heated exchange earlier in the evening between her father and an eager suitor whose debts made him a useful lever in the compact's operations. Testimonies, ledgers, and private notes suggest the moment was fraught with threat. One reconstruction holds that Evangeline intended to transfer documents to a foreign representative waiting nearby, but that others intervened. Perhaps a conservatory conversation alerted interested parties to her plans. Perhaps servants, accustomed to obedience, were manipulated into creating opportunities. The evidence of rearranged floorboards and opened safes complicates any picture of voluntary flight. Someone had knowledge sufficient to seek the same proofs she was moving to preserve. Another possibility is escape that met mischance. She might have left to catch a carriage that never departed, or she may have been waylaid on a dark path to a waiting conveyance. What complicates all reconstructions is the coordinated deniability that followed. Sealing orders, recusal, and a family narrative prepared with counsel made the chain of custody evaporate. In the absence of an uncontested trail, many plausible stories exist, and none can be proved beyond doubt. For those who mapped ledger against sequence, the arithmetic of motive and opportunity favored certain names and methods. Debts made men pliable, foreign interests made concealment profitable, legal tactics made public inquiry slow. Mrs. Sedgwick's key, the Providence post office box, and the reversed combination were a slender chain of hope. Those who guarded it carried both risk and possibility for revelation. The legal aftermath reinforced a lesson that has rippled through time. Power protects itself by converting inquiry into inconvenience. Federal agents, initially curious, found their pathways clogged. Records that should have been public became a palimpsest of redactions and missing pages. Editors who pressed for publication were softened by offers of patronage. Those who pushed were threatened with suits that could silence a paper for generations. The institutions that should have served as corrective instead became instruments of attrition. This pattern matters because it teaches a technique: make truth expensive. If pursuing facts requires time, money, and social risk, many will choose the cheaper exit of silence. That calculus shaped Newport's responses and later shaped how historians encountered the past. But it also offers a vector for resistance. If truth seekers can coordinate resources, deploy persistent publication, and preserve archives, they can overcome attrition by persistence. As you listen, imagine the psychological conversion Evangeline hoped for. The instant a private fact becomes public and the social calculus shifts. That conversion is part material and part ritual, naming names, placing documents in public view, insisting institutions respond. For listeners, the process can be transformative. Attention itself is force. When eyewitnesses, clerks, and archivists move from private doubt to public testimony, the architecture of control begins to crack. These mechanisms persist today. When corporations shape research, when media gates what matters, when litigation becomes a blunt instrument to silence. Recognize the continuity: first awareness, then collective action. Document, litigate where possible, support independent journalists, and teach younger generations how to hold institutions accountable through persistent, public-minded practice. Refuse complacency daily. If the Cunningham affair teaches anything about concealment, it also points to interventions that matter. Transparency is not a slogan, but a structural practice. Open records, accessible archives, and clear chains of custody reduce the capacity for concealment. Independent oversight bodies, appointed with checks that prevent capture, can buffer concentrated wealth and fragile public trust. Public funding for investigative reporting and legal aid for journalists creates conditions where exposure is possible without ruin. Whistleblower protections matter too. When clerks or minor officials risk careers to preserve truth, they must have legal and social protections allowing disclosure without crushing retaliation. Evangeline's case shows how much depends on small acts of conscience. A clerk misfiling a line, a foreman hiding a packet, a retired teller donating cancelled checks. Those acts persist because a culture values courage and organizes protection so it can be repeated. Law reform is essential. Litigation should be a pathway to accountability rather than a tool of attrition. Reducing the effectiveness of strategic lawsuits aimed at silencing critics, tightening disclosure standards for public servants with private ties, and instituting stronger conflict of interest rules for judges and prosecutors can change the calculus that made suppression cheap and truth expensive in Newport's summer. Conclude with concrete practices, robust public archives funded by endowments, legal aid for investigative reporting, open corporate registries to reveal ultimate beneficial owners, robust whistleblower hotlines with independent oversight, and educational curricula teaching historical skepticism. Small, institutional investments in those areas reduce power asymmetries and protect ordinary people from becoming ledger entries and dignity. Legacies are never tidy. The Cunningham name persisted in marble and philanthropy. Windward Hall continued as a place of pageantry. Public histories celebrated enterprise and civic generosity, yet beneath proud stones ledger lines persisted in attics and basements, in private journals, and in margins of court files. Evangeline's dissolution into myth did not make evidence vanish. It redirected memory into fragments requiring assembly. Myth and history coexisted uneasily. One offered comfort, the other friction and correction. For affected communities, this duality meant pain and purpose. Families who kept letters safe became custodians of inconvenient knowledge. Historians connecting dots became irritants to comfortable narratives. That friction is the engine of revision, correction, and partial justice. Evangeline's image, once flattened into a tragic anecdote, regained shape through those who refused to let her be only a caution. Her notebooks, decrypted and cross-referenced, allowed later generations to see not only cruelty but also courage. Her courage was tactical defiance grounded in knowledge. Remembering her as strategist and moral agent reframes the story from melodrama into lesson. To those listening now, your attention is an instrument. Stories like Evangeline's are not only for historians, they are training grounds for civic discernment. When you archive, share responsibly, fund rigorous journalism, or teach skeptical reading, you perform the same guardianship that small clerks and hesitant editors once performed. These acts ripple sometimes slowly, but they can change how power is constrained in practice deliberately. We end not with certainty, but with a charge. The mystery of Evangelene Cunningham resists tidy resolution because power is practiced precisely to create ambiguity, to make proof prohibitively costly, and to render motive into plausible misfortune. Yet ambiguity does not equal innocence. It is often the residue of deliberate opacity. The ledger, the letters hidden in walls, and marginal notes preserved by ordinary people offer a counterweight to that opacity. They are small, stubborn repositories of fact that refuse to dissolve entirely. Imagine a ledger page unfolded, a photograph labeled, a letter read aloud. The air shifts, the polite script of history stutters, and a new sequence of memory begins. Those moments are rare and fragile, but they are real. Recovery is not a single heroic act, but a series of small recoveries, a clerk's misplaced line, an archivist's careful cataloguing, a journalist's persistent query, a family's choice to preserve rather than discard. These cumulative acts create pressure for accountability where systems had expected quiet. As you listen, let the story do what the best narratives do: alter your posture toward institutions and towards small acts of courage. Become uneasy with convenient narratives that tidy violence into explanation. Consider that names deleted from memory often have living consequences. When you encounter archived fragments or a footnote that hints at erasure, let that prick of discomfort become a prompt to ask more questions, to support transparency, or to preserve records that would otherwise vanish. If you are changed by this story, no change is the intention. The ritual of witness is simple: remember, name, and protect. Do so not for spectacle, but as civil practice that resists the economy of concealment. Tonight the mansion's lights have faded into history and the ledger sits in boxes in a few caring hands. Power can hide, and yet ink and memory endure. Let the veil lift by persistent attention, carry the ledger within your memory, and refuse comfortable endings today onward.